It's not fair. Magnesium, potassium, they all get so much attention when we're talking about deficiencies, but nobody focuses on like the biggest one that we should be paying attention to. Salt, sodium, the stuff that like regulates almost everything in our bodies. It's not always easy to identify when you have a sodium deficiency, when you're low in sodium. In fact, a lot of people end up finding out after the fact, oh, your serum levels of salt were pretty darn low. Salt regulates so many functions within our body, and it is critical for nerve firing, which means that there's a lot of different things that I could point out and say, oh, that could be this, that could be that. But I want to give you 3 pretty clear indicators that you are low in sodium. Now, if you're someone that follows a lower carb protocol, or maybe you do some intermittent fasting, like a lot of people that watch my channel, there's a higher likelihood that you're going to be deficient in sodium. So you can pay extra attention to this video. But in general, we excrete sodium a lot. Sweat, urination, we end up losing a lot of it. So let's jump right into it. The first one is intriguing. It is hunger. When you are deficient in salt or just have an electrolyte deficiency, you can be much more hungry. And it's not just necessarily for salty foods. Here's how it works. So before we get into the kind of the mechanisms and how it works, there's a really intriguing study. I really got a kick out of this one. Okay, this study looked at rats, but it demonstrates exactly how we act when we are craving salt. So the study was published in the journal Current Biology, and it looked at rats, and it gave them a hypertonic solution, saline solution, so very concentrated salt water, basically. So rats that were normal, that didn't have any sodium deficiency, they had regular serum levels of sodium, when they consumed the salt water, they acted completely disgusted. They ran the other direction. They were like, no, kind of a panicking. There was a lever that the rats could pull to administer more salt water. The rats tried to bury it, tried to break it, tried to get rid of the lever. Like anything that had to do with, hey, don't give me that salt water. Here's what's wild. The rats that were deficient in sodium, that had low levels of sodium, inherently got excited and elated over the salt water. They tried to get more. They were licking the lever, pawing at the lever, trying to get more to release. Okay, so everything was the same with these rats except for the fact that some were deficient in salt and some weren't, showing that like the intuitive sort of inherent cravings for salt can make them almost react almost insane to get salt. Sound familiar when you're raiding the pantry? Okay, let's dive into the mechanisms here. So when we are low in sodium, we have an increase in a hormone called angiotensin II, which also acts as a neurotransmitter. Now, a neurotransmitter travels to the brain and signals the brain to say, hey, this person needs to consume something. Can you start programming them to go crave some salt and crave some water? So it can actually trigger hunger and thirst. Usually makes you crave salty foods, of course. What's interesting is it can make you crave water too, which if you were to just pound a bunch of water, when you're already salt deficient, well, that can exacerbate the problem, right? Anyhow, there's some other interesting mechanisms too. We have some things called the NST neurons in the hindbrain. Okay, and what can happen is angiotensin can actually trigger those NST receptors to do their job differently. Now, what these NST receptors, or excuse me, NST neurons do is they typically inhibit us from wanting salt. They usually stop us from wanting to eat salt. So when angiotensin acts upon these NST neurons, it inhibits that NST neuron's effect. So suddenly the blockade that kind of blocks us from wanting to eat a bunch of salt is suddenly lifted and we want to crave salt again. Okay. Now, when we look at how the brain works, there's something called the mesolimbic dopamine system. Now, the mesolimbic dopamine system is responsible for taking senses and translating them into actions, okay? i.e. like dopamine, right? This is where things can get weird because if you're craving salt and you are someone that is a little bit impulsive, there's nothing to say that you're not going to go out and crave other things because you're still working upon that same mesolimbic dopamine system, that region of the brain. This is very, very important because this is what makes you just go and eat anything. The other situation that we encounter is if you're craving a salty food, you probably are consuming a sweet food too. So then you're running into a blood sugar situation. So it's almost safe to say that the lines kind of get crossed. And when you're craving salt, you could also crave something sweet. It's pretty wild. The next one is one that's a lot more obvious, but we don't always pay attention to it. That's weakness and fatigue. I mean, I, for one, if I get fatigued in the middle of the day, I don't typically go and say I'm going to have salt. I'm still not programmed that way, right? I automatically assume any weakness or any fatigue is because I didn't sleep well, because I have small kids, find any excuse in the book. Sometimes it's actually quite simple, and it would be a pretty easy fix to test, and you're probably not going to hurt anything by trying a little bit. But what exactly is going on? Well, there was a study that was published in the journal Nutrients, okay, and this demonstrated that especially people that were on like a lower carb protocol, they found that more than likely the initial weakness and fatigue that people that start like a low carb protocol, the way that they're feeling is probably a result of lower sodium levels because you're excreting more sodium with lower insulin levels. And they demonstrated this with Inuits, because Inuits eat predominantly ketogenic, and simply because they're not consuming many carbs, right? And they found that because they're consuming salt water in ice form and everything like that, and consuming like caribou blood soup, which sounds kind of gross, but it's got a lot of salt in it, they weren't having the same effects that other people would have. So it's kind of interesting, but we have to understand how salt works. When you have a nerve and you have a neuron, okay, that neuron, when it gets a signal, when it gets stimulated to do something, an action potential, the sodium and chloride that normally sit on the outside of a neuron rush to the inside, okay? And at that same time, potassium rushes out. Well, okay, obviously very important. This whole shift that occurs there is what triggers an impulse, a nerve impulse, to send that electrical charge to make a muscle contract. Okay, a lack of sodium can attenuate this, makes it so that you're not able to get as much potential strength, or your nerves just aren't able to fire. And this isn't anything new, right? Like obviously electrolyte supplements have been marketed for a long time because of this, right? And Gatorade has been talked about because of this, because when you're sweating and you're losing sodium, yeah, you want to maintain your performance. So yes, you bring in some salt. But again, on a lower carb protocol or fasting or anything like that, you pay extra attention to it because the rate in which you lose sodium is even faster. Today's video sponsor, if you are doing keto or if you are fasting or anything like that, or actually anything really, is Thrive Market. They're an online membership-based grocery store. So if you're looking for specific kinds of better for you foods that you can't necessarily find in the grocery store, Thrive Market has them all in one place. So you can go there, sort by any kind of diet type, like paleo, you can sort by keto, you can sort by vegan, you can sort then like in subfilters, like baking categories underneath that. I mean, it's really unreal. So it's made it so you get like this fully tailored shopping experience, and then everything just gets delivered to your doorstep. It's awesome. You get it in a couple of days. So there's a link down below. Because they are today's sponsor, it's a 25% off discount link off your first purchase. So you get 25% off, plus you get a free gift. You gotta use the link that's down below. You just drop down the description tab, and it's right there in the first couple of lines. So check out Thrive Market after this video. There was actually a study that was published in the journal BMC Geriatrics. Now, this was looking at elderly patients, but they looked at 75 people that were deficient in sodium, and then over 2,000 that had normal values, right? Okay, and they assessed various things like skeletal mass index, their grip strength, their walking speed, funny things like how long they could stand on one leg, but they're actually practical, real life things. And you make fun of them, but then you realize that's actually a practical thing. I usually do most of my work when I'm standing on one leg. It's kind of common for me. But they found that, what they found is that the group that was lower in sodium, they couldn't stand on one leg for as long. So they couldn't hang with me. Okay, they also had decreased grip strength and lower skeletal mass index. So long story short, yeah, everything that they measured was a little bit lower if they were lower in sodium. Okay, so enough about that. You feel weak, you feel fatigued, it might not be a bad idea to have a little bit of salt and see if it improves things. If not, go take a nap. The next one is a huge one, irritability. This is wild because, again, you get fatigued, especially on keto, low carb, whatever, and you start getting like irritable. You don't always realize it. This is fascinating because lower levels of sodium can equate to higher levels of cortisol. Check this out. This study was published in Practical Laboratory Medicine. It took a look at 3,268 participants over 23 months. Okay, so almost 2 years. And they found that there was a very solid correlation between hyponatremia, lower levels of sodium, and increased levels of cortisol. But okay, well, that's obviously not good. Cortisol to have super elevated all the time in a chronic state is not exactly the best thing, but how does that actually make us irritable? Because doesn't anger and irritability and stress cause high cortisol levels? So is it actually going the other way? Well, it's interesting. Here's another study. So this study took a look at 60 subjects that were administered some cortisol. Okay, they gave them a direct infusion of cortisol. And what they found, and this is going to sound funny, they had increased feelings of arousal during their sadness. Now, that's not what you think. It's not a bunch of sad people hitting the rack. It is the fact that they had a more pronounced sadness, like they were more aroused by it. It was like more of an outgoing sadness. It's like advanced sadness. So what I mean by that, and if you look at the mechanisms, is it's affecting the region of the brain that directly ties into emotion. So what it did when there was cortisol, it inhibited the subgenual cingulate. Okay, this is a region of the brain that again ties sort of emotion to feelings and almost action. So what it did in terms of brain regions is it inhibited the subgenual cingulate. It's a region of the brain that is very much so associated with sadness, not just in normal sadness, but also like pathological, like clinical sadness and depression, right? So very pronounced. So it essentially enhanced the sadness. So if you're already a little bit stressed out or a little bit sad, having higher levels of cortisol can make that more pronounced. And if lower levels of sodium and sodium deficiency can lead to higher levels of cortisol, then you can sort of elucidate that you're going to have a little bit more of an irritable response to things. I notice it, and I've noticed that if I add a little bit of salt back in, it does kind of balance me out. Kind of mixes up with that whole hangry thing. You're hungry plus you're irritable. So those are two symptoms of low sodium levels. Now I want to address something that's very important too. Low levels of cortisol can also reflect in lower levels of sodium too. Although this is a little bit more of a clinical thing that I don't need to go down that rabbit hole on. Okay, so what that's indicating is like if you're low levels of cortisol or you have like adrenal insufficiency, then you're not pumping out cortisol, you're not pumping out aldosterone as much, which means you're excreting more sodium, which means you're losing sodium, and that in turn can be a little bit more of a chain reaction. So we don't need to focus on that too much. Another thing that's important to pay attention to, and I'll kind of end on this note, is lower levels of sodium equaling higher levels of cortisol can reflect in higher levels of visceral fat. So essentially, you're excreting more sodium at that rate. So then you have lower sodium. That makes it so the adrenals don't have enough sodium to really pump out cortisol and do their job right. So that's a whole different ball game and something that probably needs to be addressed in a different video. So again, just to recap, craving salty things, craving even some sweet things, just craving food in general, craving a bunch of water, okay? Then also trying to bury a lever that gives you salt. Just kidding. Okay, then weakness, fatigue, things like that. Okay, then irritability or advanced sadness, if that makes sense. As always, keep it locked in here on my channel. I'll see you tomorrow.